The Louisiana sun beat down mercilessly on the cotton fields of St. Clair Plantation, its rays creating shimmering waves of heat that danced above the endless rows of white bowls. The year was 1854, and the humid air carried the sound of field hands singing work songs, their voices rising and falling in rhythm with the scrape of hoes against the hard-packed earth. Among the workers, one man stood apart, not for his size or strength, but for the way others looked at him. Elijah Washington moved through the cotton rows with deliberate care, his weathered hands gentle as he picked each bowl. At 43, his dark skin bore the scars of decades under the whip, but his eyes held something that unnerved both master and slave alike, an unwavering certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond this world of bondage. "There goes that fool again," muttered Samuel, a younger slave working the adjacent row. He watched as Elijah paused in his picking, tilting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. "Man's been touched in the head since his boy died." The other workers nodded in agreement. They all remembered when Elijah's son, Moses, had tried to run 3 years ago. The boy had made it less than 10 miles before the dogs caught him. Master St. Clair had made an example of him in front of the entire plantation, a lesson that still haunted their dreams. That's when Elijah had started talking about angels. "Angels walk beneath our feet," Elijah would say during the brief moments when the overseer wasn't watching. "They dig tunnels of light through the darkness, preparing the way for the righteous." The other slaves would exchange glances, their faces a mixture of pity and embarrassment. Some whispered that grief had broken his mind. Others believed the beatings had finally addled his brain. But Elijah continued his strange declarations. He spoke of underground pathways that led to freedom, of divine voices that called from beneath the earth, of a great deliverance that would come not from above, but from below. The more he talked, the more isolated he became. Master Cornelius St. Clair, a portly man with thinning hair and a perpetual scowl, found Elijah's ravings particularly amusing. During his evening gatherings with neighboring plantation owners, he would regale them with stories of his prophet slave. "How you should hear him," St. Clair would chuckle, swirling his bourbon. "Claims the Lord's going to tunnel his way to freedom. I tell you, gentlemen, sometimes I think the heat affects their minds more than we realize." The laughter that followed these stories echoed across the plantation's grand veranda, carried on the night breeze to the slave quarters, where Elijah lay on his thin mattress, listening. But instead of shame or anger, his face showed only patience, the expression of a man waiting for something he knew would come. As autumn approached, the cotton harvest intensified. The slaves worked from dawn until well past dusk, their backs aching, their fingers raw and bleeding from the sharp cotton bowls. It was during these long days that Elijah's behavior became even more peculiar. He would stop mid-task and press his ear to the ground, remaining motionless for several minutes, while the overseer, Thomas Briggs, shouted threats and curses. When questioned, Elijah would simply say, "They're getting closer, Master Briggs. The angels are getting closer." Briggs, a cruel man who took pleasure in others' pain, would respond with his whip. But no amount of punishment could stop Elijah from his strange ritual of listening to the earth. One evening, as the slaves gathered in their quarters for their meager supper of cornbread and fatback, a young woman named Ruth approached Elijah. She was new to the plantation, having been sold from a farm in Mississippi after her previous master's death. "Elijah," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the Underground Railroad, secret paths that led slaves to freedom. Is that what you're talking about, these tunnels?" Elijah looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge beyond his years. "Child, I'm talking about something older than any railroad made by man. I'm talking about paths carved by divine hands, roads that run beneath the very foundations of this cursed place." Ruth frowned. "But how do you know? Have you seen them?" "I hear them," Elijah replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day the voices grow stronger. They're calling us home, Ruth, all of us. We just have to be ready to answer when the time comes." As the weeks passed, the weather began to change. The oppressive heat of summer gave way to cooler days, but with the change came an ominous shift in the sky. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon with increasing frequency, and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Old-timers among the slaves began to mutter about the signs. The way the animals behaved, horses restless in their stalls, dogs whining for no apparent reason, birds flying in strange patterns. Even the insects seemed agitated, their usual evening chorus replaced by an unsettling silence. But while others worried about the changing weather, Elijah seemed almost excited. He spent more time than ever with his ear pressed to the ground, and those brave enough to listen claimed they could hear him whispering to the earth itself. "Something's coming," he told anyone who would listen. "Something that will wash away the old and reveal the new. The angels are preparing the way." Most dismissed his words as the ramblings of a broken man. But as the first drops of what would become the Great Flood of 1854 began to fall, some would remember Elijah's prophecy and wonder if perhaps the fool of St. Clair Plantation wasn't quite as foolish as they had believed. The rain started gently, a soft patter against the roof of the slave quarters that lulled the exhausted workers to sleep. But by morning, it had intensified into a steady downpour that showed no signs of stopping. And deep beneath the plantation, in tunnels that had been forgotten by time, something ancient began to stir. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, transforming the cotton fields of St. Clair Plantation into a muddy quagmire. What had begun as a welcome relief from the oppressive heat had quickly become a source of growing concern. The slaves huddled in their quarters, listening to the relentless drumming of water against the wooden roof, while Master St. Clair paced his mansion's parlor, watching his cotton crop slowly disappear beneath rising pools of murky water. Elijah stood at the small window of the slave quarters, his weathered face pressed against the glass, as he watched the rain cascade from the darkened sky. Unlike the others, who grew more anxious with each passing hour, he seemed almost serene. His lips moved in silent conversation, as if he were speaking to someone only he could see. "Man's lost his mind completely now," Samuel whispered to the group of slaves gathered around a small fire they'd managed to keep burning despite the dampness. "Look at him, talking to the rain like it's gonna answer back." But Ruth, who had been watching Elijah more closely since their conversation weeks earlier, noticed something different about his behavior. There was a purposefulness to his movements, a sense of anticipation that seemed at odds with the growing desperation around them. "Elijah," she called softly, "what do you hear?" He turned from the window, his eyes bright with an inner light that seemed to cut through the gloom of the storm. "They're singing, child. Down below they're singing songs of deliverance." The other slaves exchanged worried glances. Old Martha, who had been on the plantation longer than anyone, shook her head sadly. "Poor soul's been touched by the Lord in ways that ain't natural. Rain's got him thinking he's Moses himself." But as if summoned by her words, a new sound began to emerge from beneath the steady patter of rain. It was faint at first, barely perceptible above the storm, but gradually it grew stronger. A low, rhythmic rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The slaves fell silent, straining to identify the strange noise. It wasn't thunder, too constant, too regular. It wasn't the sound of flooding water, too deep, too resonant. It was something else entirely, something that made the floorboards of their quarters vibrate with each pulse. "You hear that?" whispered James, a field hand who had arrived at the plantation just the year before. "What in the Lord's name is that sound?" Elijah moved away from the window and knelt on the floor, pressing his ear to the wooden planks. The rumbling grew more distinct, and with it came something else, a sound that made several of the slaves gasp in recognition. Voices. Human voices, singing. "Sweet chariot coming for to carry me home." The faint melody drifted up through the floorboards, barely audible but unmistakably real. "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." The slaves stared at each other in bewilderment. The song was one they all knew, a spiritual that had been passed down through generations of bondage, but the voices singing it seemed to come from somewhere impossible, from beneath the very ground they stood on. "How is that possible?" Ruth breathed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and wonder. Elijah rose slowly, his face radiant with vindication. "I told you they were down there. I told you the angels were preparing the way." Before anyone could respond, the door to the quarters burst open and Thomas Briggs stumbled inside, his clothes soaked and his face flushed with alcohol and rage. The overseer had been drinking heavily since the rain began, his frustration with the weather manifesting in increasingly violent outbursts. "What's all this noise?" he slurred, swaying on his feet as he surveyed the gathered slaves. "You people supposed to be sleeping, not carrying on like you're at some kind of revival meeting." The slaves quickly averted their eyes, knowing better than to meet Briggs's gaze when he was in such a state. But the rumbling from below continued, and the overseer's expression shifted from anger to confusion as he became aware of the strange sound. "What the hell is that?" he demanded, looking around the room as if expecting to find the source of the noise hidden among the slaves. "Just the storm, Master Briggs," Samuel said quickly. Old buildings creaking in the wind, but Briggs wasn't satisfied. He moved through the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, pausing occasionally to listen. When he reached the spot where Elijah had been kneeling, the rumbling seemed to intensify, and the faint sound of singing became momentarily clearer. "There's something under this floor," Briggs muttered, his drunken mind struggling to process what he was hearing. Sounds like people." Elijah stepped forward, his movement so sudden and unexpected that several slaves gasped. "Master Briggs," he said, his voice calm and respectful despite the circumstances, "the Lord works in mysterious ways. Perhaps what you're hearing is his voice calling to the faithful." Briggs turned on him with fury, raising his hand to strike. But before he could deliver the blow, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the building, followed immediately by a sound that made everyone freeze in terror. The levee had broken. The roar of rushing water filled the air as the Mississippi River, swollen beyond its banks by days of relentless rain, finally overwhelmed the earthen barriers that had held it in check. Within minutes, the plantation would be flooded, the carefully cultivated fields transformed into a raging torrent that would sweep away everything in its path. Briggs sobered instantly, his face pale with the realization of what was happening. "The levee's gone," he whispered, then louder. "The levee's gone. Everyone to higher ground." But as the slaves began to panic, rushing toward the door in a desperate attempt to escape the coming flood, Elijah remained calm. He walked to the center of the room and knelt again, pressing both hands flat against the floor. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying clearly above the chaos. "This is the moment the angels have been preparing for. The waters will wash away the barriers, and the path will be revealed." "Elijah, we have to run," Ruth cried, grabbing his arm. "The water's coming." But he looked up at her with such certainty, such absolute faith, that she found herself hesitating. "Trust me, child. The Lord has shown me the way. We don't run from the flood, we go beneath it." As if in response to his words, the rumbling from below intensified, and suddenly, with a sound like breaking timber, a section of the floor gave way. Where there had been solid planks moments before, now gaped a hole that revealed a tunnel carved from the earth itself, a passage that stretched away into darkness, its walls lined with what appeared to be ancient timbers. The slaves stared in amazement as the impossible became real before their eyes. From the depths of the tunnel came the sound of voices, clearer now, singing songs of freedom and deliverance. "How is this possible?" James whispered, his voice filled with awe. Elijah smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "I told you, brother, the angels have been digging." Outside, the sound of rushing water grew louder, and through the windows they could see the first waves of the flood racing across the plantation grounds. In minutes, the slave quarters would be underwater. They had a choice to make: trust in what they could see and understand, or follow a man they had called a fool into the darkness below. As the water began to seep under the door, Elijah descended into the tunnel, his voice echoing back to them. "Come, children. It's time to go home." The first wave of floodwater crashed against the slave quarters just as Ruth made her decision. Without another moment's hesitation, she grabbed the hand of young Timothy, a boy of no more than 12 whose parents had been sold away the previous spring, and followed Elijah into the tunnel. "Wait!" Samuel called after them, his voice cracking with panic as the water began to pour through the broken floorboards. "We don't know where that leads. It could be a trap." But as the flood surged higher, reaching their ankles and rising fast, the choice became clear. One by one, the slaves began to descend into the mysterious passage. Old Martha went next, her arthritic joints protesting as she lowered herself through the opening. James helped her down, then followed himself, his face a mask of terrified determination. Thomas Briggs, still reeling from the alcohol and the shock of the flood, watched in drunken bewilderment as his human property disappeared into what appeared to be thin air. "Come back here," he shouted, wading through the rising water. "You can't just... Where are you going?" But his words were lost in the roar of the flood as more water poured through the windows and doors. Within moments, the overseer found himself chest-deep in muddy water, clinging to a wooden beam as the current threatened to sweep him away. Below ground, the tunnel was a marvel that defied explanation. The walls were lined with timber that looked ancient, wood that had been cut and shaped by tools that predated any plantation. The passage was tall enough for a man to walk upright and wide enough for two people to move side by side. Most remarkably, it was completely dry, despite the flood raging above. Elijah moved through the tunnel with the confidence of someone who had walked this path 1,000 times before, though Ruth was certain he had never set foot in it until this moment. Behind him, the other slaves followed in a line, their eyes wide with wonder and fear. "How is this possible?" whispered Martha, her voice echoing off the tunnel walls. "Who built this place?" "The same hands that parted the Red Sea," Elijah replied without turning around. "The same power that brought down the walls of Jericho. This tunnel has been here longer than any of us can imagine, waiting for the right moment to be revealed." As they walked deeper into the passage, the sound of singing grew stronger. The voices seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the very earth was alive with music. The songs were familiar, spirituals that had been sung in slave quarters across the South for generations, but there was something different about them here, something that made the hair on the back of Ruth's neck stand up. "Swing low, sweet chariot," the voices sang, their harmony perfect and haunting. "Coming for to carry me home." Young Timothy pressed closer to Ruth, his small hand gripping hers tightly. "Miss Ruth," he whispered, "who's singing?" Ruth looked around at the tunnel walls, searching for any sign of other people, but saw nothing except the ancient timber and packed earth. "I don't know, child," she admitted, "but they're singing freedom songs. That's got to mean something good." The tunnel began to slope downward, and as they descended, the air grew cooler and fresher. Somehow, despite being underground, there was a gentle breeze flowing through the passage, carrying with it the scent of rain-washed earth and something else, something that smelled like hope. After what felt like hours, but could have been minutes, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. The slaves emerged one by one, their eyes adjusting to the dim light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The chamber was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadows above, its floor covered with smooth stones that had been worn by countless footsteps. But what took their breath away were the people. Dozens of figures moved through the chamber, men and women of all ages, their clothes simple but clean, their faces bearing the unmistakable marks of those who had known bondage but had found freedom. They sang as they worked, their voices creating the harmony that had guided the slaves through the tunnel. "Welcome, brothers and sisters," said a woman who approached them, her smile warm and genuine. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom. "We've been waiting for you." Samuel stared at her in confusion. "Waiting for us? How did you know we were coming?" The woman gestured toward Elijah, who stood at the edge of the group with the expression of profound peace on his face. "He told us you would come. He's been preparing for this day for 3 years. 3 years, Ruth stepped forward, her mind reeling. "But Elijah's never been down here before. He couldn't have told you anything." The woman's smile deepened. "Child, there are more ways to communicate than just with words. Elijah has been calling to us through the earth itself, and we've been answering. We've been preparing this place, gathering supplies, making ready for the day when the flood would reveal the path." As if to demonstrate her words, other figures emerged from the shadows of the chamber, carrying bundles of food, clean clothes, and blankets. The slaves from St. Clair Plantation stared in amazement as they were offered bread that was still warm, water that was clean and cool, and garments that weren't torn or stained with the sweat of forced labor. "Who are you people?" James asked, accepting a cup of water with trembling hands. "We are the ones who came before," replied an elderly man with white hair and scars on his wrists that told their own story. "Some of us escaped from plantations like yours. Others were born free, but chose to help those who weren't. We've been living in these tunnels for decades, creating a network that stretches from Louisiana all the way to the Free States." Old Martha sank onto a stone bench, her legs finally giving out from the shock and exertion of the day. "This is the Underground Railroad," she breathed. "The real Underground Railroad." "Part of it," the elderly man confirmed. "But this section is special. These tunnels are older than any of us know. Some say they were carved by the first people who lived in this land, long before any of us arrived. Others believe they were created by divine intervention, prepared for a time when they would be needed most. Elijah finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. It doesn't matter who built them. What matters is that they're here and they're ours to use. The flood above isn't a disaster, it's a blessing. It's washed away the barriers that kept us trapped, and now we can walk free. As if summoned by his words, a new group of people entered the chamber from another tunnel. These were clearly conductors on the Underground Railroad, white abolitionists and free blacks who had dedicated their lives to helping slaves escape to freedom. Their leader, a stern-faced woman with steel-gray hair, approached Elijah with obvious respect. "The way north is clear," she reported. "The flood has confused the slave catchers and their dogs. We can move your people tonight under cover of the storm." Ruth felt her heart leap with a mixture of hope and terror. Freedom was within reach, but the journey ahead would be dangerous. Even with the help of these mysterious underground dwellers, there were no guarantees they would make it to the free states alive. "What about the others?" she asked suddenly. "There are more slaves at the plantation. We can't just leave them." The woman conductor nodded approvingly. "We've already sent teams to rescue as many as we can. The flood has created chaos, but it's also created opportunity. By morning, dozens of people will have disappeared from plantations across the region, and the masters will assume they drowned in the flood." As the reality of their situation began to sink in, the slaves from St. Clair Plantation found themselves faced with a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could stay in the safety of the underground chamber, hidden from the world above, but still trapped in a kind of limbo. Or they could trust in Elijah's faith, in the mysterious network of tunnels and the people who had dedicated their lives to freedom, and begin the dangerous journey north. Young Timothy tugged on Ruth's dress, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Miss Ruth, are we really going to be free?" Ruth looked around the chamber, at the faces of people who had already made this choice, who had risked everything for the chance to live as human beings rather than property. Then she looked at Elijah, whose unwavering faith had brought them this far. "Yes, child," she said, her voice strong with newfound determination. "We're going to be free." Above them, the flood continued to rage, washing away the old world and all its certainties. But below ground, in tunnels that had waited centuries for this moment, a new chapter in the story of freedom was about to begin. The journey through the tunnels began at midnight, when the storm above had reached its peak fury. The group from St. Clair Plantation, now numbering 15 souls including 3 more slaves who had been rescued from the flooded quarters, moved in single file through passages that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Elijah led the way, guided by the same inner voice that had first told him about the angels beneath the earth. Behind him, the conductor they had met, who introduced herself only as Sister Catherine, carried a hooded lantern that cast dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. The light revealed details that had been hidden in the chamber, symbols carved into the wooden supports, marks that looked like a mixture of African tribal signs and Christian crosses. "These markings," Ruth whispered to Sister Catherine as they walked, "what do they mean?" The older woman glanced at the symbols, her expression thoughtful. "They're messages, child, left by those who came before, telling others that this path is safe, that food and shelter wait ahead. Some of the marks are older than this country itself, left by the first people who used these tunnels to hide from those who would enslave them." As they moved deeper into the network, the tunnels began to branch and divide, creating a maze that would have been impossible to navigate without a guide. At each intersection, Sister Catherine would pause and consult a small compass, then lead them down one passage or another with absolute confidence. "How do you know which way to go?" Samuel asked during one of their brief rest stops. "Practice," she replied simply. "I've been running this route for 12 years. Before that, my husband ran it for 8 years before the slave catchers got him. This network has been operating for longer than most people realize. It's not just about helping slaves escape, it's about preserving something that was almost lost." Old Martha, who had been struggling to keep up despite the help of James and Timothy, sank onto a wooden crate that had been left in an alcove. "What do you mean, preserving something?" Sister Catherine set down her lantern and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "These tunnels aren't just escape routes. They're libraries, archives, repositories of knowledge that would have been destroyed above ground. Look." She opened the journal to reveal pages covered with handwritten text in multiple languages, English, French, Spanish, and scripts that none of the slaves recognized. There were maps, diagrams, and what appeared to be genealogical charts tracing family lines across generations. Every person who passes through here leaves something behind, Sister Catherine explained. A story, a song, a piece of their history. We've been collecting these fragments for decades, preserving the memories and traditions that slavery tried to erase. Elijah approached the journal with reverence, his weathered fingers tracing the pages. "My son Moses," he said quietly. Before he tried to run, he used to tell stories his grandmother taught him. Stories about our people before the ships, before the chains. I thought they were lost when he died. "Nothing is ever truly lost," Sister Catherine assured him. "If you remember even fragments, we can help you piece them together. That's part of what we do here. We help people remember who they were before they were told they were nothing." As they prepared to continue their journey, a new sound echoed through the tunnels, the distant barking of dogs. The group froze, their faces pale with terror. Every slave knew that sound, the baying of bloodhounds trained to track human scent through swamp and forest. "They're searching for us," James whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Even in this flood, they're still hunting." But Sister Catherine remained calm, listening carefully to the direction and distance of the barking. "They're above ground," she said finally. "The dogs can't track through running water, and the flood has washed away most scent trails. They're searching blind." Even so, she quickened their pace, leading them through a series of tunnels that sloped steadily downward. The air grew damper, and soon they could hear the sound of running water, not the chaotic roar of the flood above, but the steady flow of an underground stream. "This is the deepest part of the network," Sister Catherine explained as they emerged into another chamber. This one smaller than the first, but filled with the sound of flowing water. "The stream connects to the Mississippi, but it runs clean and clear. We can follow it for miles without leaving any trace." The chamber contained several small boats, clearly built for navigating the underground waterway. As the group climbed aboard two of the vessels, Ruth noticed that the walls here were covered with more symbols, but these were different, newer, more elaborate, telling stories in pictures and words. "These are beautiful," she breathed, studying a section that depicted people walking through tunnels toward a rising sun. "Each one represents a successful journey," explained a new voice. They turned to see a young man, perhaps 20 years old, emerging from the shadows. His skin was light enough that he could pass for white in dim light, but his eyes held the wariness of someone who had known bondage. "This is Marcus," Sister Catherine said by way of introduction. "He'll be guiding you on the next part of your journey." Marcus nodded to the group, his expression serious but kind. "I was born on a plantation in Mississippi," he told them. "Escaped 5 years ago with the help of people like Sister Catherine. Now I help others make the same journey." As they began to navigate the underground stream, Marcus shared his story. His father had been the plantation owner, his mother a house slave. When his father died, his half-brothers had sold Marcus south, unwilling to acknowledge their mixed-blood sibling. "I thought I was going to die in those cotton fields," he said, as he guided their boat through a narrow passage. "But then I heard about the tunnels, about people who had found a way to disappear completely. It took me 3 tries to find the entrance, but when I did..." He gestured around them at the tunnel walls, where the symbols continued to tell their silent stories. "I found more than just an escape route. I found a community, a purpose, a way to turn my pain into something useful." Young Timothy, who had been silent for most of the journey, finally spoke up. "Are we really going to make it? Are we really going to be free?" Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Child, you're already free. The moment you stepped into these tunnels, you stopped being property and started being a person again. Everything from here on is just about making it official." As they traveled deeper into the network, they encountered other groups, families and individuals who had escaped from plantations across Louisiana and Mississippi. Some had been traveling for days, others for weeks. All shared the same expression of cautious hope, the look of people who dared to believe that freedom was possible. At one rest stop, they met an elderly woman named Sarah who had escaped with her 3 grandchildren after their parents were sold away. She had been traveling for 2 weeks, following the underground network from plantation to plantation, gathering other escapees along the way. "The flood has been a blessing," she told them as they shared a meal of bread and dried fruit. "Masters are so busy trying to save their property and their crops, they haven't noticed how many of us have gone missing. By the time they realize what's happened, we'll be long gone." But even as they celebrated their progress, the reality of their situation remained dangerous. They were still deep in slave territory, still hundreds of miles from the free states. The network of tunnels and safe houses would only take them so far. Eventually, they would have to emerge into the world above and face the risks that came with traveling as fugitive slaves. As they prepared to continue their journey, Elijah gathered the group around him. In the flickering light of the lanterns, his face looked younger somehow, as if the act of leading others to freedom had restored something that years of bondage had taken away. "I want you all to remember this moment," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "Remember that when the world told us we were nothing, we found a way to become everything. Remember that when they said we had no power, we discovered we had the power to save ourselves and each other." He paused, looking at each face in turn. "And remember that this journey doesn't end when we reach the free states. Freedom isn't a place, it's a responsibility. We have an obligation to come back, to help others find their way, to make sure these tunnels stay open for those who come after us." As they climbed back into the boats and continued their journey through the underground stream, the sound of singing began again. Not the ghostly voices they had heard before, but their own voices, raised in harmony as they sang the songs that had sustained them through years of bondage and were now carrying them toward freedom. Above them, the storm continued to rage, washing away the old world with its floods and fury. But below ground, in tunnels that had been carved by hope and maintained by courage, a new world was being born. One person, one family, one act of faith at a time. 3 days into their underground journey, the group faced their first real crisis. The stream that had been carrying them north suddenly widened into a vast underground lake, its far shore lost in darkness. Marcus, who had been confidently guiding them through the tunnels, stared at the expanse of black water with obvious confusion. "This isn't right," he muttered. Consulting a hand-drawn map that had been folded and refolded so many times, the creases were wearing through. "The lake should be much smaller. We should be able to see the other side." Sister Catherine, who had been traveling with them for the first part of the journey before planning to return south to guide other escapees, studied the water with growing concern. The flood above must have affected the underground waterways too. This lake has risen far beyond its normal levels. The implications were terrifying. Their boats were small, designed for navigating narrow streams, not crossing what appeared to be an underground sea. The water was completely still, its surface like black glass that reflected their lantern light in wavering patterns. There was no way to know how deep it was or what lay beneath its surface. "We could go back," Samuel suggested, his voice tight with anxiety. "Find another route," but Marcus shook his head. "The other routes would take weeks, and we don't have that kind of time. The longer we stay underground, the more likely it is that someone will discover the entrance we used." "We need to keep moving forward." Old Martha, who had been growing weaker with each day of travel, looked at the dark water with resignation. "Lord, help us," she whispered. "We've come so far just to be stopped by more water." It was then that Elijah stepped forward, his face calm despite the crisis they faced. "This is another test," he said simply. "Just like the flood that revealed the tunnels in the first place. We're being asked to trust in something we can't see or understand." He walked to the edge of the water and knelt, placing his hand on the surface. The lake was so still that his touch created ripples that spread out in perfect circles, disappearing into the darkness beyond their lantern light. "The angels brought us this far," he continued, his voice carrying the same certainty that had convinced them to follow him into the tunnels. "They won't abandon us now." Ruth watched him with a mixture of admiration and fear. Elijah's faith had saved them once, but this seemed different. The tunnels had been real, solid, something they could touch and walk through. This was asking them to trust in something that seemed impossible. "Elijah," she said gently, "even if we try to cross, our boats might not make it. The water could be too deep, too rough. We could all drown." But before Elijah could respond, young Timothy spoke up from where he sat in one of the boats. "Miss Ruth, look at the water." They all turned to see what the boy was pointing at, and gasped in amazement. Where Elijah's hand had touched the surface, the water was beginning to glow with a soft, phosphorescent light. The glow spread outward from his touch, creating a path of luminescence that stretched across the lake toward the far shore. "How is that possible?" James breathed, his voice filled with wonder. Marcus, who had seen many strange things in his years working the Underground Railroad, stared at the glowing water in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this. It's as if the water itself is alive." Sister Catherine, practical even in the face of the miraculous, began to examine the phenomenon more closely. "It could be some kind of natural phosphorescence," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Certain minerals in the water, disturbed by movement." But Elijah was already pushing one of the boats into the water, and as it moved forward, the glow intensified, creating a clear path across the lake. "Natural or divine," he said, "it's showing us the way. That's all that matters." One by one, they climbed into the boats and began to follow the glowing path. The water remained perfectly calm, as if the lake itself was cooperating with their passage. As they rowed, the phosphorescent trail continued to spread before them, always staying just ahead of their boats, guiding them through the darkness. The crossing took hours, though time seemed suspended in the strange, glowing twilight of the underground lake. As they traveled, they began to see things in the water, shapes that moved beneath the surface, too large and too purposeful to be fish. But whatever they were, they seemed benevolent, swimming alongside the boats like escorts ensuring safe passage. "There," Marcus called out suddenly, pointing ahead. "I can see the shore." The far side of the lake materialized out of the darkness, revealing a sandy beach and the mouth of another tunnel. As their boats touched the shore, the phosphorescent glow began to fade, leaving them once again in the circle of light cast by their lanterns. They pulled the boats onto the beach and gathered their belongings, still awed by what they had experienced. But as they prepared to enter the next tunnel, they discovered they were not alone. A figure emerged from the shadows, an elderly Native American man with long gray hair and clothes that seemed to be made from materials that belonged to the earth itself. His presence was so unexpected that several of the group stepped back in alarm. "Peace," the man said, raising his hand in a gesture of greeting. "I am Joseph Crow Feather. I have been waiting for you." Sister Catherine stepped forward cautiously. "Waiting for us? How did you know we were coming?" The old man smiled, his weathered face creasing with lines that spoke of decades spent outdoors. "The same way your friend knew about the tunnels," he said, nodding toward Elijah. "The earth speaks to those who know how to listen." He gestured toward the tunnel entrance behind him. "These passages were carved by my ancestors, long before any Europeans set foot on this continent. They were created as sacred pathways, routes of pilgrimage and refuge. When the first enslaved people found them, my people recognized kindred spirits, others who understood what it meant to have their freedom stolen. Joseph Crow Feather led them into the tunnel, which was different from the others they had traveled. The walls here were covered with paintings, ancient pictographs that told stories of journeys and transformations, of people finding their way from darkness into light. For generations, my family has been guardians of this section of the network," he explained as they walked. "We help maintain the tunnels, provide supplies and guidance to those who pass through. It is our way of honoring the sacred nature of these paths." As they traveled deeper into this new section of the network, Joseph shared the history that had been hidden from the world above. The tunnels, he explained, had been used by various groups throughout history. Native Americans fleeing forced relocation, escaped slaves seeking freedom, even white abolitionists who needed to move secretly through hostile territory. "The network is larger than most people realize," he said. "It stretches from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border, with branches that reach into every state. Some sections are natural caves, others were carved by human hands. All of them are connected by something deeper than stone and earth." They stopped for the night in a chamber that served as one of Joseph's supply stations. Here they found fresh food, clean water, and warm blankets. But more importantly, they found hope. The walls were covered with messages left by previous travelers, testimonies of successful journeys, and expressions of gratitude for the help they had received. Ruth read some of the messages aloud. "Made it to Detroit, October 1852. Thank you for showing us the way. Family of 6 reached Canada safely. The children are in school now. Freedom is real. Don't give up." As the group settled in for the night, Elijah sat apart from the others, his eyes closed in what appeared to be deep meditation. Joseph Crow Feather approached him quietly and sat down beside him. "You hear them too," the old man said. It wasn't a question. Elijah opened his eyes and nodded. "The voices. They've been with me since my son died. At first, I thought grief had driven me mad, but the longer I listened, the clearer they became. They are the spirits of all who have traveled these paths before us," Joseph explained. "Slaves and free people, Native Americans and immigrants, all those who have sought refuge in the earth's embrace. They guide us because they remember what it means to search for home." As the night deepened, the two men sat in comfortable silence, listening to the voices that only they could hear. Around them, the other members of the group slept peacefully, their dreams filled with visions of the freedom that lay ahead. But even as they rested, challenges awaited them in the tunnels ahead. The network was vast and complex, but it was also dangerous. Not all who entered these passages emerged safely, and the journey to freedom would test every ounce of faith and courage they possessed. Tomorrow would bring new trials, new tests of their resolve. But tonight, in the safety of the underground chamber, surrounded by the messages of those who had succeeded before them, they allowed themselves to believe that freedom was not just a dream, but a destination they would reach. The morning brought devastating news. Joseph Crowfeather returned from a scouting expedition with word that slave catchers had discovered one of the tunnel entrances 50 miles to the south. They were systematically searching the network, using dogs and torches to flush out anyone hiding in the passages. "How long do we have?" Sister Catherine asked, her face grim as she studied the map of the tunnel system. "Maybe 2 days before they reach this section," Joseph replied. "But there's something else. They're not just looking for escaped slaves. They're looking for the network itself. Someone has told them about the tunnels." The implications hit the group like a physical blow. If the Underground Railroad had been compromised, it meant that hundreds of people who depended on the network for their freedom were now in mortal danger. It also meant that their own journey had become exponentially more perilous. "We have to warn the others," Ruth said immediately. "All the people still traveling through the tunnels, all the safe houses." "We will," Joseph assured her. "But first, we have to get you to safety. You're too close to freedom to turn back now." He led them to a section of the tunnel they hadn't seen before, where the passage split into 3 different directions. Each route, he explained, led to a different destination, one to the Free States, one to Canada, and one back south to help coordinate the evacuation of the network. "This is where we part ways," he said solemnly. "Each of you must choose your own path." The decision tore at the group that had become like family during their underground journey. Samuel and James chose to head north to the Free States, hoping to find work and start new lives. Old Martha, despite her age and frailty, insisted on going to Canada, saying she wanted to live somewhere that slavery had never existed. But it was Elijah's choice that surprised everyone. "I'm going back," he announced quietly. "Back south, to help evacuate the network." Ruth stared at him in disbelief. "Elijah, you can't. You've come so far, suffered so much. You deserve your freedom." "Child," he said gently, "I found my freedom the moment I started listening to the voices beneath the earth. Now those voices are telling me that my work isn't finished. There are still people trapped in those tunnels, still families that need to be guided to safety." Young Timothy, who had barely spoken since they learned about the slave catchers, suddenly stepped forward. "I want to go with him," he said, his young voice steady with determination. "Timothy, no," Ruth protested. "You're just a child. You should go north, get an education, have a real life." But the boy shook his head. "Miss Ruth, I don't have any family left. Master St. Clair sold them all away. Elijah's been like a father to me on this journey. If he's going back to help people, then that's what I want to do too." The debate continued for hours, but eventually the group made their final decisions. Ruth chose to go north to the Free States, hoping to establish herself and then return to help others. Samuel and James would accompany her. Old Martha would continue to Canada with Sister Catherine, who had decided to escort the elderly woman personally. Elijah and Timothy would return south with Joseph Crowfeather, joining the dangerous mission to evacuate the compromised sections of the network. As they prepared to separate, each group taking different tunnels toward their chosen destinations, the weight of their decision settled over them. They had survived the flood, navigated the underground maze, crossed the mysterious lake, and formed bonds that would last a lifetime. Now they were choosing to split apart, possibly never to see each other again. "Before we go," Elijah said, gathering them all together one last time. "I want each of you to remember something. We didn't just escape from slavery. We discovered something that slavery tried to take away from us. We discovered that we have the power to save ourselves and each other." He looked at each face in turn, memorizing the features of people who had become his family. "Whatever happens next, wherever our paths lead us, we carry that power with us. We are living proof that freedom isn't something that can be given or taken away by others. It's something that comes from within, something that no master can ever truly control." Ruth felt tears streaming down her face as she embraced the man who had led them out of bondage. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing when the rest of us couldn't." "Thank you for following when belief was all I had to offer," he replied. One by one they said their goodbyes, each parting weighted with the knowledge that they might never meet again. As the groups entered their respective tunnels, the sound of singing began again. Not the ghostly voices they had heard before, but their own voices, raised in harmony as they sang the songs that had sustained them through their journey. Ruth's group traveled north for 3 days, following tunnels that gradually sloped upward toward the surface. When they finally emerged, it was into a world transformed by the flood. The landscape was scarred and changed, but it was also cleansed, as if the waters had washed away more than just soil and debris. They were met by conductors who had been waiting for them, white abolitionists and free blacks who helped them complete their journey to Detroit, where they would begin their new lives as free people. The transition was difficult, filled with challenges they hadn't anticipated. Freedom, they discovered, came with its own set of problems. Finding work, learning to navigate a world where they were no longer property but weren't yet fully accepted as equals. But Ruth never forgot the lessons she had learned in the tunnels. She established herself as a seamstress, saved every penny she could, and within 2 years had earned enough money to return south and help fund rescue operations. She never saw Elijah again, but she heard stories. Tales of a man who seemed to appear wherever slaves needed help escaping, who could find hidden passages that others missed, who spoke of angels walking beneath the earth. Old Martha made it to Canada, where she lived for another 15 years, telling stories of the underground journey to anyone who would listen. Her accounts, dismissed by many as the fantasies of an elderly woman, were actually some of the most accurate records of the network's true scope and complexity. Samuel and James both found work in Detroit's growing industrial sector, but they never forgot their promise to help others. They became part of the support network that helped newly arrived fugitive slaves establish themselves in the free states, providing practical assistance and emotional support to people making the same transition they had made. And in the tunnels beneath the South, Elijah and Timothy continued their work, guided by voices that only they could hear, helping families and individuals find their way to freedom. They saved dozens of lives before the network was finally discovered and destroyed by Confederate forces at the beginning of the Civil War. But by then, their work was nearly complete. The war that would end slavery was beginning, and the underground paths that had provided refuge for so many would soon be replaced by armies marching toward a different kind of freedom. The tunnels themselves were sealed and forgotten, their entrances hidden by time and deliberate concealment. But the stories lived on, passed down through generations of families who remembered ancestors who had disappeared into the earth and emerged as free people. And sometimes, in places where the old network once ran, people still report hearing voices singing beneath their feet, songs of freedom and deliverance, carried on underground winds that blow through passages carved by hope and maintained by courage. 20 years after the Great Flood of 1854, Ruth Washington, she had taken Elijah's surname in honor of the man who led her to freedom, stood before a gathering of former slaves in a Detroit church. The Civil War had ended, the 13th Amendment had been ratified, and slavery was officially abolished throughout the United States. But the work of freedom, Ruth had learned, was far from over. "Many of you have heard stories about the Underground Railroad," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary. "You've heard about safe houses and secret signals, about brave conductors who risked their lives to guide people north. All of those stories are true, but tonight I want to tell you about something else, about a network that ran deeper than any railroad, about passages that were carved not just through earth, but through faith itself." In the audience, gray-haired men and women leaned forward, recognizing something in Ruth's tone that promised a story unlike any they had heard before. Some were former slaves themselves, others were abolitionists who had worked the traditional underground railroad routes. All of them had heard whispers of something more, something that defied conventional explanation. Ruth told them about the flood, about Elijah's seemingly impossible faith, about tunnels that appeared when they were needed most. She spoke of the underground lake that glowed with phosphorescent light, of Native American guardians who had maintained the network for generations, of voices that sang from the very walls of the earth. "Some of you are thinking this sounds like fantasy," she said, noting the skeptical expressions on several faces. "Some of you are wondering if the trauma of slavery has affected my memory, made me confuse dreams with reality." She paused, then reached into a leather satchel beside the podium. From it, she withdrew a collection of items that made the audience gasp in recognition. Pieces of timber carved with symbols, stones that seemed to glow with their own inner light, and most remarkably, a journal filled with maps and testimonies from dozens of people who had traveled the underground network. "These are real," she said simply. "The tunnels were real. The people who maintained them were real. And the freedom they provided was as real as the freedom we celebrate today." An elderly white woman in the front row raised her hand. Ruth recognized her as Sarah Bradford, a prominent abolitionist who had worked with Harriet Tubman on numerous rescue missions. "Mrs. Washington," Sarah said, "I've been involved with the Underground Railroad for 30 years, and I've never heard of these tunnels you describe. How is it possible that such an extensive network could have existed without our knowledge?" Ruth smiled, understanding the woman's confusion. "Mrs. Bradford, you worked with the railroad that was built by human hands, maintained by human courage, and operated according to human understanding. What I'm describing is something older, something that existed alongside your network, but operated according to different principles." She opened the journal to a page covered with testimonies written in different hands, different languages, spanning decades of use. The underground network wasn't just about escaping slavery, it was about preserving something that slavery tried to destroy, the knowledge that freedom is a birthright, not a privilege. The tunnels were maintained by people who understood that some things are too important to be left to human institutions alone. As Ruth continued her presentation, sharing maps and testimonies that documented the network's extent, a commotion arose at the back of the church. The doors opened and a figure entered that made Ruth's heart skip a beat. It was Timothy, no longer the frightened boy who had followed Elijah into the tunnels, but a man of 32, his face bearing the lines of someone who had seen much and endured more. Behind him walked another figure that made Ruth gasp aloud. Elijah Washington stood in the doorway, his hair now completely white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes still holding that same unwavering certainty that had convinced a group of terrified slaves to follow him into the earth 20 years before. He was older, frailer, but unmistakably alive. "Elijah," Ruth breathed, stepping down from the podium as the entire congregation turned to stare at the man who had become legend. He walked slowly down the aisle, Timothy supporting his arm, and the crowd parted before them like water. When he reached Ruth, they embraced with the fierce joy of family members long separated, tears streaming down both their faces. "I told you we'd see each other again," Elijah said softly, his voice still carrying that gentle authority that had guided them through the darkest passages. "The angels told me you were here, telling our story." The congregation sat in stunned silence as Timothy helped Elijah to a chair near the podium. Ruth, still overwhelmed by their unexpected reunion, struggled to find her voice. "We thought, after the war started, when the tunnels were discovered and sealed, we thought you might have been captured, killed." Elijah shook his head with a slight smile. "Child, you can't kill something that was never fully alive in the way most people understand it. The network wasn't just tunnels and passages. It was an idea, a promise, a covenant between the earth and those who needed refuge." Timothy stepped forward, his own voice strong and clear. "We saved over 200 people in those last years before the war," he announced to the gathering. Families, individuals, children who had been separated from their parents. The tunnels kept working right up until the moment they weren't needed anymore. An elderly black man in the middle of the congregation stood up slowly. "I remember you," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You're the one they called the Underground Prophet. You helped my family escape from a plantation in Alabama in 1859. My wife, my 3 children, we all made it to Canada because of you." Others began to speak up, sharing their own memories and stories. A woman from Mississippi who had been guided through the network in 1857. A man from Georgia whose entire extended family had been evacuated when their plantation was about to be sold. One by one, they testified to encounters with Elijah and Timothy, to journeys through tunnels that seemed to appear and disappear as needed. But how? Sarah Bradford asked, her scientific mind still struggling with the implications. How could such a network have operated without leaving more evidence? Where are these tunnels now? Elijah looked at her with compassion, understanding her need for rational explanation. Mrs. Bradford, you've spent your life fighting slavery with the tools of this world. Safe houses, coded messages, careful planning. All of that was necessary and sacred work. But some battles require different weapons. He gestured toward the journal Ruth still held. The tunnels existed because they were needed. They were maintained by people who understood that the earth itself has a memory, that it remembers every foot that has walked upon it in freedom and every drop of blood that has been spilled in bondage. Timothy added, when the war ended and legal freedom came, the tunnels began to close themselves. Not because they were destroyed, but because their purpose had been fulfilled. The network was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be a bridge between slavery and freedom. Ruth opened the journal to its final pages, which she had never shared publicly before. These are the last entries, she said, reading from testimonies dated 1863 and 1864. People reporting that tunnels they had used before were no longer accessible, that passages had filled themselves with earth, that the voices had grown quiet. But the legacy remains, Elijah said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Every person who traveled those tunnels carried something with them. Not just their own freedom, but the knowledge that freedom is possible, that there are always paths for those who have the courage to seek them. He looked out over the congregation, his gaze taking in faces of every color and background. The Underground Railroad that you all know about was the visible part of something much larger. It was the part that could be documented, mapped, studied, but beneath it, supporting it, was something that couldn't be captured in reports or government records. What happens now? Asked a young man who had been taking notes throughout Ruth's presentation. If the tunnels are gone, if that network no longer exists, how do we honor what it represented? Elijah smiled, the expression transforming his aged face. Son, the tunnels were never the real network. The real network was the connections between people, the willingness to risk everything for someone else's freedom, the faith that there's always a way forward even when you can't see it. He gestured toward Ruth, toward Timothy, toward the faces in the congregation. Look around you. Every person in this room is part of the network now. Every act of courage, every moment when you choose to help someone else find their path to freedom, that's the Underground Railroad continuing its work. As the evening drew to a close, people began to approach Elijah and Timothy, sharing their own stories, asking questions, seeking guidance for the challenges they faced in their new lives as free people. Ruth watched with wonder as the man who had led her out of slavery continued to lead others not through physical tunnels now, but through the equally treacherous passages of post-war America. Later, as the church emptied and the three old friends sat together in the quiet sanctuary, Ruth asked the question that had been weighing on her heart. Elijah, do you still hear them, the voices? He was quiet for a long moment, his head tilted as if listening to something beyond the range of normal hearing. They're different now, he said finally. Quieter, but still there. They're not calling for rescue anymore. They're singing songs of celebration. They're telling stories of children who are learning to read, of families that are reunited, of people who are building lives they never dreamed possible. Timothy nodded in agreement. The voices aren't gone. They've just changed their message. Instead of come down into the earth for safety, they're saying rise up into the light and claim what's yours. As they prepared to leave the church, Elijah turned to Ruth one last time. You did well tonight, telling our story. But remember, it's not just our story anymore. It belongs to everyone who hears it, everyone who needs to believe that there's always a way forward. Ruth nodded, understanding that her role as keeper of the story was just beginning. In the years that followed, she would travel throughout the North and the reconstructed South, sharing the testimony of the Underground Network with anyone who would listen. Some dismissed her accounts as folklore, others embraced them as spiritual truth. But all who heard the story carried something away with them, a seed of hope that would grow in their own lives and the lives of their children. The physical tunnels might have closed, but the underground railroad that Elijah had revealed, the one that ran through faith and courage rather than just earth and stone, continued its work. It operated now in schools where former slaves learned to read, in churches where integrated congregations worshipped together, in communities where people of all backgrounds worked side by side to build a more just society. And sometimes, in quiet moments when the world seemed darkest, people would swear they could still hear it, the sound of voices singing beneath their feet, carrying songs of freedom and deliverance through passages that existed not in the earth, but in the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to accept that any chain can hold it forever. The Underground Railroad had never really been about trains or tunnels. It had always been about the simple, revolutionary idea that every human being deserves to be free, and that there will always be those willing to risk everything to make that freedom possible. In the end, that was Elijah's greatest miracle. Not the tunnels he revealed or the voices he heard, but the faith he inspired in others. Faith that freedom is always possible, that there's always a way forward, and that no one has to make the journey alone. The angels, it turned out, had never been walking beneath the earth at all. They had been walking among them all along, disguised as ordinary people with extraordinary courage, digging tunnels of hope through the darkness of human cruelty, one act of love at a time.